Good evening, everyone. Well, it is 6 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to introduce Will Charles, who is a planner in the Community Development Department, and he's going to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Will?
Thanks, Nancy. Tonight, our guest speaker is Heidi Agler. She is the managing director and co-founder of Root Policy Research. Ms. Agler co-founded Root Policy Research to further the role of applied research in community planning. She started her research and consulting career as an economic analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis after graduating from the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. She's a former member of the Denver Planning Board and is a frequent presenter on housing policy. She has been invited speaker for the American Planning Association, Rocky Mountain Land Institute, National Association for County, Community, and Economic Development, and National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, everybody. And I'm delighted to be here with you all this evening. I think this is a really cool thing that the city does. I am just going to start by sharing a PowerPoint. So let me make sure that I can do that well, and then we'll jump in and I'll give you a sense of what I am going to cover and how y'all can ask me questions as I go along. So you should see my PowerPoint now, and I'm going to put it in the slideshow, and we will get started. Excellent. So I can see, I think when you raise your hand. If you have any questions as we go along the way, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to talk about affordable housing and all the kind of complexities that go along with housing markets, the definition of affordable housing. I'm going to touch on why we have problems, and we'll talk about solutions and what some peer cities are doing. The idea that I had here as we go through the agenda is I put this in 3 different parts, starting with an introduction. So just to ground everybody about what affordable housing is, why needs exist, how those of us in the industry think about and measure affordable housing needs, and then a little bit of the economics of development and why we're in the pickle that we're in, particularly in Colorado and in the Front Range. I'll stop and take questions then, and then move on to housing needs assessments, what those look like, what they offer communities, what you should look for if you're planning on doing one of those, or perhaps you've done one in the past and you might have questions about that. And then last but not least, and most importantly, solutions. So I'm going to start with, and actually I should say, I think you all have about an hour and a half for this. Typically, my guess is my presentation will take about 40 minutes, so there'll be a lot of time for questions, and then hopefully I can provide you with the answers. So when we think about affordable housing, what the typical definition is, people in the industry, and this is actually true of the affordable industry as well as just the general private sector industry, how do they think about what's affordable? Generally, we define that based on your gross household income. So household is affordable if the costs are less than 30% of your gross monthly income. And the interesting thing about that is when I say housing, in terms of housing costs, I'm talking about if you are a homeowner, your mortgage payment, everything that goes into that. So the interest that you pay, your homeowner insurance, if you have private mortgage insurance, property taxes, that big bundle that is your mortgage payment, as well as any critical utilities. If you're a renter, it would be your rental payment and any utilities on top of that. So this cost burden measure doesn't take into account many of the household costs that have been growing quite a bit, such as medical or childcare. So it's not really truly a reflection sometimes about what a household can manage, particularly as these other costs have gone up. When you are paying 30% or more than 30% of your income, your gross household income toward housing costs, you are what we call cost burden. And if you're paying more than 50%, you are severely cost burdened. People who are severely cost burdened are typically the folks we worry about the most. These are people who are at risk of foreclosure, at risk of eviction, may need to leave their home and go live with somebody else to stabilize. So when you hear people talk about severely cost burdened, they're typically talking about people who are very low income and suffer from housing instability. When we look at cost burden by income level, it is very, very typical because we've not had enough resources to house people who are very low income for folks to be severely cost burdened if they're earning less than, it used to be $25,000 a year. It's a little higher now. So it's about $30,000 a year is typically the cutoff for severe cost burden. What we're seeing now in Colorado is as housing prices have gone up quite a bit, you're seeing movement into what we call the middle income brackets of cost burden. So it used to be very uncommon for people to be middle income. So, your teachers, people who work, maybe retail and service, who are middle managers in those industries. It wasn't very common for them to be cost burdened, and now it's quite common. So we've seen a movement of burden into these middle income brackets. When we look at where people live by income category, the first thing to notice here is the MFI, which is median family income. In the housing industry, that's also referred to as area median income, or AMI. They basically mean the same thing. And HUD, which determines a lot of the eligibility criteria for housing programs, typically, these are typical brackets that HUD, or typical categories that HUD puts household incomes into when it qualifies people, the agency qualifies people for housing assistance. And the first is what we call extremely low income. These are people in the front range who are making less than $30,000 a year, and that would be for a 4-person household. These folks are typically what you think of when you're thinking about people living below the poverty line. So you'll hear the reference to 30% AMI or 30% MFI in the industry a lot. And you should think of, these are the folks I'm talking about when I was talking about severely cost burden. They're almost always severely cost burden. They might be couch surfing. They may be experiencing episodes of homelessness. They may be paying a lot of money for their rent. If they're lucky, they have been able to find public housing, but wait lists for public housing are really long. They may have a Section 8 or a housing choice voucher, also called tenant-based rental assistance. So that's different than the rental assistance that you've been hearing a lot about with the pandemic. They could be living in something called transitional housing. And transitional housing is housing where people spend about 2 years getting on their feet, and then they hopefully move to permanent housing or nonprofit provided housing. But really the main takeaway here is these are people who are very vulnerable. This is the area of need in almost every community in which we work. And these folks almost exclusively need some kind of subsidy to make ends meet. There's very, very little housing, privately provided housing where the rents are low enough to meet those needs. For folks who are in the very low income category, so $30,000 to $50,000 per year, they often live in the same kind of products. So they need the same kind of subsidies to make ends meet. There's also something called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, and this is a program where a private sector investor, a partner, will get a tax incentive over a period of time if they invest in developing affordable apartments. And they partner with a housing authority typically, or a housing developer who specializes in LIHTC is the acronym we use to refer to that. So folks in this very low income category often live in LIHTC. If they apply to be Habitat for Humanity, if they apply to that kind of a program, which is a sweat equity program, so they help build their house and they get a loan from Habitat, or a land trust, and that is where the nonprofit entity owns the land and they own the unit, then they may be able to achieve home ownership. So a lot of what we see, like entities like Habitat for Humanity serve, they're typically in that 50 to maybe 70% MFI bracket. When we move into what's called low income, so those are folks making between 50 and 80% of MFI, they generally live in privately provided rental housing, although that is changing quite a bit. So it is not unusual anymore to see 50 to 80% MFI folks living in housing with some kind of a subsidy because they can't find affordable housing on the private market. When we do analyses and we look at how the market has shifted over time, what we see is that the private market used to do a pretty good job of providing affordable housing to people in this income bracket, and even as low as like $40,000 a year and sometimes $30,000 a year households, but that's changed quite a bit as our market has accelerated, and so those rental units have moved up a cost category, and there's very little left of privately provided housing that is naturally affordable. So folks between 50 and 80%, they typically are renters, but they can achieve ownership if they participate in the programs that I talked about. Sometimes with inclusionary housing programs, they can get deed restricted units. So there's quite a wide variety of products that serve that income bracket. And then above that, once we hit the 80%, and then typically housing programs go up to 120%, although in our very expensive resort areas, 150% of MFI folks typically need subsidies. These are people who can live in privately provided rental housing without a subsidy, and they're the target for homeownership programs. So down payment assistance, as well as some of those shared equity programs that I talked about, or affordable units that are produced through inclusionary zoning. Now, you may be wondering, why do we have these needs today? We get this question a lot, particularly we present a lot in front of city councils, and they inevitably ask, how did we get here? What happened? And this is, I think, pretty universally understood right now, the market factors that came together to create the supply constraints we have. So big picture, Colorado has not been building enough housing in general. We haven't been building enough affordable housing at all. We haven't been building enough housing to accommodate people who are moving here to work or moving here to retire. And then on top of that, and I'll talk about this in a moment, or show you some graphics of this, a big portion of our units, particularly in the resort areas, go towards second homes and more commonly toward vacation rental by owners. So there's a segment of our housing stock that used to be many years ago was occupied by workers, retirees, residents, that is no longer serving that need. So when we haven't been developing enough, which we haven't been for many, many years, and we haven't been our development in Colorado has lagged demand significantly. It's hard to catch up. It's easy for somebody to get a rental truck, move out here, take a job, or live with a roommate for a little while until they found a job and create that demand for a new unit. It's very hard for everything to come together to actually build that unit. So that's part of the constraint that we're in right now. The other thing that you hear a lot about is people are buying second homes, people are investing in Colorado, they're paying cash for units because interest rates are low, because there's so much demand to live here and it's easy to rent a unit. So all of these factors come together and influence what's going on in the housing market. It's really hard to isolate just one or two as being the reason for the gap that we have right now. And then it's also very true that construction and labor costs are very, very high, in some cases higher than they've ever been. We have in Colorado been lacking construction labor since the Great Recession. When we were building a lot before the Great Recession, we had a lot of immigrants who were working in Colorado. Many of them left after the recession and didn't return from their home countries. So we have both commodities as well as labor cost constraints. The other thing I like to talk about is these, what I would call commitment issues. So until very recently, as in the last 3 years, housing was, and for many, many years, housing was really a low-income person's problem, if you will. So there's a lot of debate about whose problem is it, who should address it. The federal government has played many, many different roles, some very problematic roles in the past before civil rights and fair lending rules were passed in the provision of housing. So the federal government has been an actor, and a bad actor in many ways, a better actor in some during some periods, but nobody has really owned this problem until very recently. Housing is always addressed reactively and not proactively, typically because there's not enough money to address affordable housing needs as they should be addressed. Now, there are some exceptions out there, and I'll talk about those when we talk about solutions. The other factor here, item 3, is that I would argue that the return from the investment in housing is really hard to measure. We know that we stabilize people. There have been some studies that have been done locally that have looked at, if I'm not cost burdened and I'm spending money in the local economy, what does that mean to the local economy? And those are very positive returns. But that math is hard to do, and these are investments that probably take, quite honestly, longer than an elected official's term to realize. So if I'm an elected official and I'm trying to get reelected, it's more convenient for me to turn to the public transit system that I helped create, or the community center that I helped create, rather than say I had a role in building affordable housing. It's just not been a super popular thing to do until very recently. And then again, just back to this not my job philosophy, that the responsibility of housing just hasn't really lived with one entity. And that's a lot of why we're in the problem that we're in today. We don't have the capacity to address housing because we've never really built that capacity. And again, this is, somewhat unique to Colorado, but not exclusively unique to Colorado. Some of the things that we should have anticipated that we didn't, such as demographic changes. So the millennials and subsequent generations are pretty big. They are aging into categories in their lifespan where they need independent housing. They're getting out of college, they are moving out of their parents' homes, and particularly the millennial generation, which was really big, caused a huge influx of demand. The other reason that I would give is what I call hyper-concentrated preferences. Both the millennials and their parents, the baby boomers, are very locational specific in where they want to live. They tend to have more money than other generations and the luxury of being able to choose where they want to live. And Colorado is a very popular state to move to right now. I would also argue, I call some of the markets on the west and east coasts of the U.S. that are very desirable as being closed. They're still less affordable than ours. And so, compared to California, compared to New York, our rents are quite a bit lower, maybe $1,000 to $1,400, $1,500 a month. And so we still look affordable to people who have been paying a lot more for housing. Number 4, years and years of underinvestment by the federal government. I talked about this just a moment ago, but particularly what we've seen with COVID is even when you have an influx of money, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of news stories about this with the rental assistance program, if you don't have people or systems that can deploy that money, it doesn't go out. And the federal government really has not invested in the infrastructure of housing provision above and beyond ownership and the LIHTC program and the Section 8 voucher program. So we're really not equipped to be able to deal with situations that we haven't, innovative housing types or situations that we haven't anticipated in the past. It's not equipped to be like an emergency response system. And then, of course, COVID-19 just exacerbated all of these things. So a little bit about where Colorado's been. I talked a lot about production, and this gives you some production trends. So the 90s, this surprises a lot of people, but the 90s were one of the highest growth periods, more so than now. And that's when a lot of the baby boomers came to Colorado. We had tremendous employment growth. We were recovering from the downturn in the 80s. And so you can see here that we ramped up. We had some pretty high production, and we had pretty steady production. Because of that increased demand in the late 90s in particular, development was really high in the early 2000s, up until about 2007. The Great Recession hit, and it really dropped off. And we're starting to catch up, but we really haven't, relative to our growth, caught up with where we need to be. So this graphic here shows you housing units to households, and it's a measure of vacancy. You need a certain number of vacant units, or a certain proportion of units that are vacant, for the market to be able to flow, for people to be moving in and out of units, selling units, downsizing or upsizing, and making those units available to others. And we just haven't been able to achieve that with our lack of construction. When we actually adjust this to take into account seasonal vacancies, what we see here is that this is the orange here, shows you that adjusted number. That hasn't fluctuated as much as what you see the units per household. So what that tells us is that the units that were available, say in 2010, where the units per household number was bigger, have been repurposed into seasonal units. And so we're seeing more stability in units when we adjust for seasonal vacancies than for those that are not occupied by seasonal or occupied for seasonal use. So I talked a little bit about the 0 to 30% folks, and the 30 to 50% folks as having the greatest housing needs, but I want to touch on just a couple of other categories. And those include both seniors and families. Seniors tend to, they tend to do a little bit better than low-income families because of Social Security. So for a long time, seniors have had, supplemental income through Social Security, and that has given them stability. When we look at cost-burdened owners, so there's a fair amount of owners in every community that are in that 0 to 30% income bracket, but own their home, and their burden is typically in maintenance and in property taxes, and those are almost always seniors. So if I'm a low-income senior and I'm likely to have a disability as well, if I'm an older senior, I typically age in place, particularly if I'm an owner. I'm attached to my home. Assisted living is really expensive. I don't want to leave, and I probably can get by if I have some kinds of services up to a point. Even if I could get in assisted living, if I was in any kind of affordable housing, even if I could get into some kind of independent living, if I was in affordable housing, I wouldn't have services. So the one thing that HUD and housing providers have not figured out and have not done well at all is to pair housing with services. Typically, I get housing in one way, my services I cobble together in another way, but it's very, very rare that you see, when you need affordable housing and services provided in the same place. To get those, I have to pay for assisted living, and that's very, very expensive. The other issue that we have when we think about seniors is the low salaries of home health care workers. So it is increasingly difficult to find folks who will accept the salary that home health care workers get paid and the long commute to work in that industry. So the unfortunate situation is that most low-income seniors live on their own, and they live with very, very minimal services. This became a real crisis during COVID, when people couldn't provide those services and there were seniors living by themselves. Meals on Wheels is a wonderful job of providing meals, and I believe that they continued that in many communities during COVID, but there were a lot of challenges trying to administer telehealth to seniors when they couldn't be seen in person. And I feel like that the COVID situation really gives us a picture of what a senior is living through if they don't have adequate services or adequate in-home health care. So there are many people who are still living in that state of inadequate care. When we think about how to serve seniors, so if we could, and there's some products that provide senior housing with services, some that are affordable, there's some increasing more housing is being developed for seniors that have some level of services. So that's a good thing. We'd like to see more of that for renters. The other solution is property taxes. So waivers on property taxes, exemptions on property taxes are one way to help stabilize seniors who want to stay in their homes, as well as rehabilitation programs. That helps a lot. So the largest needs of seniors, in addition to needing that assistance for renters as well as homeowners, are home repair, accessibility improvements, and then in some cases they'll need rental assistance as well. The other thing that I should mention that's not on the slide is seniors are one of the largest growing segments of homelessness. So although you may think you don't see a lot of seniors who are homeless, or maybe you do, it's a very fast growing population, particularly women, because their shelters often accommodate single men and have not really moved to accommodating women or families. So in terms of families, when you look at demographic data and you look at shifts in families in and out of communities, sometimes we did an analysis for Boulder many years ago, and they were pretty sure that because Boulder was becoming so expensive that families must have left the community. And we found that actually families didn't, but what happened is that high-income families replaced low-income families. When we do surveys of people and we ask if they've experienced displacement and why, the number one reason is typically my rent went up more than I could afford. And the number two reason is my landlord sold my home and I was displaced. And that's a typical situation for a low-income family. The other thing that I just want folks to really recognize is single parents are typically, and very, very low income families are typically a hidden side of homelessness. So it's best to go, when you want an accurate account of homeless families, the school districts. Your school districts typically have that best count. Single parents face, particularly single parents of color, female-headed households, face some of the worst discrimination when we look at direct housing discrimination due to having children, due to their race, and then something called source of income. It is very common these days for landlords to require 3, and now we're hearing 4 times the rent in income. So if my rent was $1,000 a month, I would need, under the 3 times rule, I would need to earn $3,000 a month to be able to even qualify. I have to show that on my application to qualify for that rental unit. Some are now requiring 4 times, which would put me at $4,000 a month. Some landlords say I will only count earned income. So I will not count child support. I will not count alimony. If you're disabled, I'm not going to take your SSDI, so your fixed income payment. And this is what we call a disparate impact on families with children. If a single mom who's working part-time or maybe working full-time and trying to take care of her children, oftentimes that single parent will rely on alimony or child support to make ends meet. If a landlord does not accept that as part of their income, it's nearly impossible for them to find housing in the private market. I mentioned this before, the cost of childcare also exacerbates this problem. And then finally, the significant lack of affordable housing to serve their family needs. If you look around you at what's getting developed, particularly in like downtown Denver, it's very, very popular for developers, private sector developers, to build singles, which is a 1-bedroom or a studio. Those are easy units to build. We've had a huge influx of millennials, really easy to rent those units. But in many areas, there's a significant need for family-friendly housing too. So 1 to 2-bedroom units, family-friendly amenities. So thinking about, rather than having like a bike storage, you would have an area to put toys, and developers tend not to default to family-centered developments as much as young working people developments. So I'm going to go through a couple of housing economics, and then I'll stop and take some questions. We did a study for CHAFA. So CHAFA is the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, and they issue the LIHTC credits like I talked about. They make mortgage loans. They typically serve lower income households. They operate a little bit like they're kind of quasi-private sector, like a bank. And we did a study for them looking at how much it costs to develop a typical apartment unit and what are the elements of those costs. And we did this for CHAFA because, and this was probably 2014 or 2015, they were seeing those costs go up, and they wanted to understand what was driving those and how they might be able to respond to still be able to produce affordable housing efficiently. So when we look at the various costs that go into development, the biggest one you see is hard costs. And that includes everything from landscaping to actually building, bricks and mortar, parking. And this is driven by both the cost of labor as well as the cost of commodities. So concrete's really expensive right now, lumber's really expensive right now. But overall, we typically see these costs at 70% of total development costs. Soft costs or design, engineering, consulting, your lawyers, accountants, all of that kind of stuff that goes into a development that's part of a development, that's typically about 20% of hard costs is how we model that, or 14% of overall development. And then there's financing and contingency, and last but not least, land. When we put all these things together, and we created a cute little graphic here showing what the typical cost is for a 5-story multifamily project. This looks at the city and county of Denver. It may surprise you all to learn that that's about $300,000 a unit to build, and that would be an apartment building, apartment unit. So it's very, very expensive to build housing right now, and that's part of our problem. The other thing that I would add is when we think about scaling housing, it is not true that there's a linear relationship between, so my costs get lower as I build more units, because the way you construct a multifamily development changes. So there are sort of inflection points at which it is very efficient for a developer to build a multifamily development, and that is a 3-story walk-up is the cheapest thing that I can build, and that's why we see so many of them in the metro area. A 4-story is generally is a little less affordable because I typically have to put an elevator in the unit. Same with 5-story. When I move beyond 5-story, sometimes I have to move to a different type of construction to be able to get some height. And if I'm moving beyond 7 and 8 stories, I have to go to a steel frame. So many zoning codes, because it feels okay to neighbors to have maybe an 8 or a 10-story, their building heights are responding to design, to neighborhood character, to what the community says feels tolerable, but not really to the economics of housing development. So when you think about density bonuses, which are really popular right now, if I was giving a developer a density bonus to go from 8 stories to 12 stories, they'd almost never take me up on it, meaning that if they built some affordable housing, I'd let them build 12 stories. It's not cost efficient for them to do that. So if you do density bonuses, you really have to think about the economics and study those so that those are what we call meaningful bonuses, meaning that a developer will actually respond to that incentive and you'll get affordable units. So another kind of term that's really popular right now is missing middle housing. And I talked a little bit about those shifts in cost burden. So it's no longer just our lowest income residents in our community. They're experiencing cost burden. This has moved to our sort of $50,000 to $75,000 a year folks. So what you might think of as middle income workforce, recent college graduate, middle manager in retail or service. We did this analysis for Tacoma, Washington last year. So they're going through a process where they are adding some flexibility in all parts of the city, adding some density and targeting those missing middle income brackets, trying to figure out how could we add gentle density, both in terms of apartment complexes, so go up to 4 stories from 3 stories, as well as offer duplexes to fourplexes in single family detached neighborhoods. So we did a little bit of modeling to see how much affordability would that really bring to Tacoma. And we divided it into low cost areas and high cost areas. We modeled duplexes, townhomes, a 3-story residential rental, at a smaller scale, a sort of average scale, as well as a 7-story. And I would say, this is where the supply constraint and that intersection with the high costs of labor and building has really created a very, very difficult situation. It's expensive for me to build even a duplex or a townhome right now. So our market sales price, ideal market sales price, was $350,000 to $405,000. The equivalent AMI in Tacoma there is 120 to 135%. So probably a little higher than I'd like it to be if I'm trying to get those missing middle brackets. But I would lose money in that situation. A developer, it probably costs them between $500,000 and $600,000 to build a duplex or a townhome. So it's really, really hard to make these missing middle housing units affordable without some kind of subsidy right now. And with that, I'm going to go ahead before I move on to housing needs assessments. Just invite any questions or areas of clarification. I think I can see if you raise your hand or just jump right in and ask. Do you have questions? Okay, I'll just go ahead and move forward then. I'm going to talk about housing needs assessments. So here I'm pivoting to talk about how you know where you have housing needs and how you should think about housing needs assessments. So I only have one slide on this, and I'm going to get off and give you a little demonstration of a housing needs assessment that we typically did, or that we recently did. But a housing needs assessment is a study where you're asking the question about what are our needs. So you'd like to know who lives in my community, and sometimes you have those demographic trends in your comprehensive plan, but oftentimes you're not updating that recently enough that you really have a good sense of how your demographics have changed. So that's always the starting point, is to just ask the question, like Boulder did when I mentioned that study that we did for them not too long ago. Are we losing families? And if not, what's going on, or what's the income distribution of our families today versus 10 years ago? So demographics is a starting point for understanding both your current needs and then forecasting future needs. And we can pull a lot of that data. We're really fortunate in Colorado to have a great state demographer. And so we typically pull that data both from the census and from the demographer. And we look at trends in rents and for sale home prices. Trends in rents typically can be pulled from the Apartment Association of Metro Denver has done a survey for a very long time. They do a very good survey of market and affordable developments. Most of them are market, but it gives you a sense of not only the changes in rental costs, but also in trends over time. For sale home prices, you can typically gather that through analyzing assessors data, or you can buy the data, the multiple listing service data. You can buy and understand how those are changing. What we look at when we do those analyses is we look at not only the movement of those units among different price categories or cost categories. But then we step back and we ask the question of who can afford this stuff these days? So what type of employees can afford it? What type, if a senior can afford to remain in their home, if a young person could afford to buy, who is your market serving? And then moving on to the third gap here, or the third bullet here, where is that gap? So a gaps analysis compares the supply of housing with demand using income as a proxy for demand. So we put all that stuff together and then we come up with primary needs and solutions for consideration. And that's typically where a housing needs assessment stops. And I'll give you a little bit of a demonstration of one that we did recently. Many of our clients, and the City of Westminster, we did this for them a few years ago, will separate their needs assessment from their strategy. So with a strategy, you're beginning with those housing needs assessment findings and then thinking about and spending a lot of time on the solutions. Your housing needs assessment may have some recommendations in it, but the strategy is where you really think about what are we going to do and how are we going to get there. So in Westminster, I think we started this in 2015, we did a housing needs analysis, a market analysis, presented that to City Council after staff had reviewed it, and then they went into a housing strategy formation. They brought together a task force, and these were all types of people. So folks representing city departments, people representing private sector developments, new home builders, people representing the affordable housing industry in Westminster, people representing the sweat equity programs like Habitat, Land Trust. So all these folks came together. We held monthly meetings. Initially, we presented the results of the market analysis so everybody understood where the needs were. And then we moved on to discussions of solutions. And the way that I did that in Westminster, and I've done this in Las Cruces, New Mexico as well, is to present them with best practices, things that we know that work in peer cities, and then the committee decides, they vote, if you will, and if they're going to move forward with that or not. So an advisory committee, I highly recommend, if you have the time and the ability to do that, because it brings a collective impact to the housing strategy, and your city council can see that there was more than just one voice at the table in crafting that strategy. So I'm going to let me stop my share right here and show you a little bit of what we just did. In Southwest Colorado. So we were hired to do a study for the Southwest COG, and this is a collection of governments covering the counties of Archuleta, Dolores La Plata. I have a stuck mouse here. There we go. Montezuma and San Juan. And we built this dashboard for them where they could easily take a look at, so this is their definition of AMI right here by county, as well as the maximum affordable monthly rent or mortgage. And I thought this, if you have to do math quickly on your feet, you're not very good at it, and this always comes up, I feel like, in city council meetings. It's nice to have this kind of shortcut to both income thresholds as well as the maximum affordable monthly rent or mortgage. When I was talking about, the low-income people by household size, you can see the variance in income here. There's the low and here's the very low. So this is my 80% of AMI. This is my 50% of AMI. And then this translates to what they could afford in either a mortgage payment or rent. And the other thing that we did, so it was kind of cool, I can compare counties with this dashboard. So if I wanted to compare Archuleta, for example, with Dolores County, let's see here, my keyboard doesn't seem to be wanting to cooperate. Then I can add counties as I go along. One thing that we wanted to do here, so let me I'm going to just look at San Juan County because it's pretty telling, is look at changes in housing units and then by type. So non-seasonal renter occupied, non-seasonal owner occupied. And as well as sort of rental households and how those moved in and out. This is San Juan County is where Silverton is located. Silverton is the biggest town in San Juan County, and they've had a really big increase in employment. I think they may have, off the top of my head, this will sound small to you, but it's a small community, 100 new workers. But as you can see, they lost 5 housing units over the last decade, and then they had this conversion of units to seasonal. So they lost what were renter occupied and owner occupied, presumably by workers, to seasonal use. So this gives you a big picture of how the housing units change. We also looked at short-term rental activity because it's important pretty much anywhere anymore, but very important in mountain communities to see how those listings had changed. The other piece of a housing needs assessment that's really important to understand is to compare the change in median rents with a change in median renter income. So in a community where your housing prices are going up rapidly and your incomes may be going up rapidly, you may feel like, well, you may ask the question of, well, what's the problem? It seems to me that people can afford housing because they're getting paid more. Incomes are going up. A lot of rich people are moving to Colorado, so I don't see what the problem is. So it's really good to start with this and see, are rents going up faster than the change in median renter income? And we typically find, not always, but we typically find a gap here, and it's usually pretty big. If even in a case, let's say this was a bit higher, where my renter income is keeping up with my change in rent, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are working in my community are still able to afford to work there. So that could be an indicator of displacement. And it's really important to look carefully at these numbers to understand what's really going on. If I see a decline in cost burden like I do here, that may mean that high income owners have moved in and displaced renters. And then last but not least, we looked here at job growth and where workers lived. So we really wanted to understand how jobs had changed. So if my jobs, and this is the region overall, my jobs increased by 6,100, I have roughly 1,500 more owners. So that's getting me sort of to that, to meet the demand for jobs. But I have 284 fewer renters. So when we did this for all the communities, we could really see the difference between job growth. Job growth is growing almost everywhere in Colorado, but the housing supply and the actual workers, so the people to respond to that job growth, is definitely lagging. So this was kind of a fun exercise because we were able to demonstrate this virtually, the findings through using this mechanism. It's called Power BI, and then it gives the planners the ability to compare and contrast, particularly since the region is so interdependent. So I'm going to stop there and see if people have questions about housing needs assessment before I move on to solutions. Any questions at this point? Yeah, I think, is it Carlson or Carson? Carlson?
More on the first part, but I wondered about, you mentioned how landlords can require up to like 4 times.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you.
Sorry about
there
that.
you go. Yeah.
You mentioned about how landlords can require like 4 times income to the cost of rent. Are there any rules around what landlords can and can't ask regarding financial situation?
Boy, that's a really good question that probably a lawyer would be better equipped to answer. We do have source of income law protection now in Colorado. So, in theory, what the situation that I described where they would refuse to take a source of income, they can't actually do that. But most people don't know that they have those rights. So I would typically say, landlords can't ask anything that is not, relevant to that application. They certainly can't ask or just, anything that would feel discriminatory and under the Fair Housing Act. So they can't have questions that would suggest they would penalize somebody, for example, because of their religion, or certainly they can't deny people housing because they have kids. That's not to say that doesn't happen.
But there aren't necessarily rules in the Fair Housing Act around financial questions. So like a landlord could try to say, show me your last 6-month bank statements and your tax return. I mean, can they do that? And your paycheck stubs? I mean, what are the limits, or are there any?
I'm not sure if there are limits, to be honest with you, but that none of that is covered in the Fair Housing Act. So the Fair Housing Act is really simple, and it's just, it states that you cannot take actions to deny somebody housing. So you'd have to be able to argue that those excessive requests, particularly if they are made by one type of person and not another, would have a disparate impact on a protected class and is denying them housing.
Right, which would be really difficult probably for someone who's experiencing that discrimination to be able to prove in any way.
Yeah, I mean, when we go ahead, Monica.
Sorry, I was just
Fine,
agreeing with
fine.
Carson of just, there's no way for that person to know what questions are being asked of other potential tenants, right? So there wouldn't, like Carson is saying, is they wouldn't know probably, and even if they did, then what is their next course of action? Is they're obviously
Yeah,
only
so-
gonna
yeah,
come
so-
anyway. They don't have an attorney on retainer.
Yep. We do have an organization here, the Denver Metro Fair Housing Center, and there's also the Colorado Center for Law and Policy, and they would be the entities, in addition to legal aid, who would be able to assist somebody in that situation. Typically where the biggest barriers, though, is what Monica said, is in that knowledge and awareness. So we also, the other piece in Colorado, we're very fortunate. We passed a Civil Rights Act a long time ago. We've had a Civil Rights Division that's very good. Our civil rights, our fair housing, the state fair housing protections are what's called substantially equivalent to federal protections. And that means that Colorado Civil Rights Division actually acts on behalf of HUD in terms of investigation and enforcement. I typically think that's a good thing. Somebody has someone to go to in Colorado, and they have regional offices, so they can go in and talk to a person more easily than call an 800 number and try and get HUD. That said, though, we have not had, our Denver Metro Fair Housing Center is relatively new, so we don't have a long history of advocacy around fair housing in Colorado, like you might see in the East Coast. We do a lot of fair housing and civil rights work, and we've done work recently in Baltimore and Richmond. We do a lot of work in Oregon, Austin, and they tend to just have way better infrastructure than we've ever had in terms of getting that information out to folks and investigating their complaints.
I have another question.
Go for it. Yeah.
So regarding like seniors on fixed income, and how one common issue is as property values increase, their property taxes are going up. And I know that Arapahoe County has some program for, I don't know the details at all, but some program for seniors on fixed income being able to have property taxes potentially freezed at a level or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know more details about that? And are there does that factor into like utility prices and other things that may cause them to prematurely have to leave their home because of cost increases?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I don't know a lot about Arapahoe County's program, but it is very typical for seniors and people with disabilities to have the ability to freeze or have exemptions from property tax increases, and that's a common way to address that. The problem I would say is, and then we have other programs, like we have an energy assistance program in Colorado that Energy Outreach Colorado runs, but the problem is they're not really in one place, right? So I would need somebody to assist me to apply for all of those separate programs. And I think particularly since so much of this is online for an older person, it probably feels really intimidating and it is just much harder. So if I had resources through a senior center or a caregiver or an advocate to help me, I could get that all in place.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. I wanted to talk through strategies here, and I would say on the positive side, I know I've been a little bit of kind of doom and gloom here, but oh goodness, let me go here. I'm just going to page, probably easier for me just to move through. I'm going to talk about, so the positive side of all of this, I'm making you dizzy, scrolling through here. I'm going to talk about solutions, and the silver lining here is that silver lining potentially to COVID and our housing situation is that people are paying a lot more attention to resolving these issues. And I would say not only in Colorado, but nationwide, and there's some terrific ideas out there, and I have a lot of faith. So construction's starting to pick up in Colorado and nationwide, and I've done this work for 25 years, and I've not ever seen so much innovation, so much collaboration, so much interest on behalf of community leaders across the political spectrum engage in this work. And so I'm very hopeful that housing has been elevated as a priority and will stay there. I think there's a realization that we as a country made a lot of bad decisions in the past, didn't invest in housing like we should have. It's a huge stabilizing factor, and there's a huge return to communities for, not having people live in severe cost burden, and that's finally starting to click. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, because this is popular right now in many communities, is inclusionary zoning. People also refer to that as inclusionary housing. In Colorado, you couldn't do, for many, many years, you couldn't include or require that developers include affordable housing in rental developments. That was not allowed. Colorado has an anti-rent control element to its constitution, and there was a developer who brought a case in Telluride, didn't want to be forced by the town to build the affordable rental units that the town was requiring, argued that that was in violation of the state constitution because of that rent control provision, and that developer won. So it's taken many years. I think that was maybe in the mid-90s or early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. So it's taken a long time for the state legislature to determine that they wanted to and how to fix that. And that fix happened in the last legislative session. So it happened early this year. So short story is, and the bill is 1117, if you want to look it up, HB 1117. Short story is, communities can require inclusionary zoning. They can include rental units in that requirement. So for sale units, never had this rent control prohibition, but I can now include rental units in my inclusionary zoning policy, but I have to give developers something back. I have to offset a part of the cost that they're taking on with I could do fee waivers, I could give them density bonuses, I can fast track their development. There's a whole suite of things that I can do. So I'm going to start with kind of talking zoning and how zoning came to be, and then talk through inclusionary zoning and things to think about if you were to entertain that policy. So just a recognition that, because there's so much conversation right now about zoning and segregation and how that led to the problems that we have today, just a recognition about where we started with zoning and what the purpose of zoning was. And there's a famous case called the Village of Euclid versus Amber Realty. And that case established zoning as a reasonable extension of a local government's police power. In that case, zoning was really looking at regulation of nuisance uses. And this is also true of many actions that we look back and say, well, those were segregative actions. But a lot of the zoning, a lot of the land use decisions that were made in the early 1900s were regulating nuisance uses. They were regulating pollution. They were trying to allow folks to get out, certain types of people, to get out of industrial parts of cities that weren't very clean. And sadly, apartments were considered a nuisance use. So some of this, you can't see I'm sorry, you can't see the text here. Let me go forward and then I'll go back and I can give if I can get it to appear. There we go. So in Euclid, some of the text that was part of that case, which I think really really demonstrates how much single-family detached units and neighborhoods were preferred, is the segregation of residential, business, and industrial buildings will make it easier to provide fire apparatus suitable for the character and intensity of development. So we start with a public health rationale, increase the safety and security of home life, especially for children, and then we sort of move to a lot of prejudice towards certain types of people. This case said that these nuisances and these problems are very often coming from apartments, calling apartment houses parasites, and then further arguing that apartments and these types of uses deprive children of the privilege of quiet and open spaces. Basically that we're taking these actions because we don't want to ruin the children in our community. I would challenge you. So I'm a former member of Denver Planning Board, and I got to hear a lot of testimony over a number of years that I was on Planning Board. But keep this in mind when you listen to discussions about uses. A lot of this is still sort of in the back of people's minds that multifamily is bad. Apartments are unsafe. They're unsafe because they create traffic. They're unsafe because bad people live there. They're unsafe because they're not lighted properly. But this is all to say, this was 1926, and a lot of these biases still exist in how we think about zoning and land use. And for the most part, it's not an accurate characterization of these uses. So a little bit about shifting to inclusionary housing. So inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning is part of a local government's zoning power. It's been around for a really long time. It originated in the 1970s in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland. When you hear people talk about Fairfax County and Montgomery County, these are very, very successful programs. They have built a lot of units, and they've been around for a long, long time. So according to a group that's the nonprofit group that studies this, Grounded Solutions, 900 jurisdictions have programs. Some states require it. So I have to, I have to allow affordable housing. I have to require affordable housing as part of developments in some states, and then some deny it. So Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, Texas, I can't do inclusionary zoning at all. Montana just excluded it just this last session, so you could include that as well. So the basics of inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, I'm requiring, if I pass this ordinance, as a condition for development, that a developer provide a proportion of low to moderate income units. These programs can be mandatory or voluntary. I've never seen a voluntary program that produces a unit. And I'll talk about a density bonus option a bit later. But inclusionary housing is typically sort of broader than zoning. Zoning is the ordinance that says if you build a 5-story development, 5% of those units need to be affordable. And in Colorado, I would have to say, and we're giving you a density bonus, or we're waiving fees, or we're fast tracking that to help offset the costs. When I talk about inclusionary housing, that's typically used a little bit more broadly. So I could say inclusionary housing program is a density bonus program, or an overlay, an affordable housing overlay, where I'm incentivizing you, developer, to take advantage of my inclusionary housing ordinance, but you don't have to. You don't have to take that density bonus. You don't have to build those affordable units unless you want to. If you're going to go down the inclusionary zoning route, so require it, you need to do a nexus analysis, and that's required to show the rational relationship to the public benefit from the ordinance. So you have to do an analysis to demonstrate that there's a need, as well as look at the economic feasibility of inclusionary zoning. Now, what happens with inclusionary zoning? So if I'm a developer and I have an investor, and I've gone through the process of getting many investors, I have a pro forma, and all of a sudden you slap inclusionary zoning on me. So you're telling me that I have to build a certain proportion of units that are affordable. That's not built into my pro forma. It lowers my return. So what I typically do, I will cross subsidize. I will charge the market rate tenants more to subsidize, to make up for that subsidy that I have to provide for the affordable units. And that's oftentimes what happens. So you'll hear the argument that inclusionary zoning raises housing costs. And it's partially true and partially not true. So yes, it might. The market tends to adjust over time, but you really have to calibrate it right so that you're not overburdening the development community, because if they stop building, then you have a problem. And you want to make sure that it actually works, that you're providing the units that are needed for the length of time that people need them. Particularly when you're thinking about this from inclusionary housing and not zoning, if I'm taking like an incentive or a voluntary approach, then I want to make sure the incentives that I provide, developers are going to take advantage of them. And those studies, the nexus and the economic feasibility studies, help get you there. So we get a lot of questions about, does this work, which is the right question, and the answer is sometimes. So there are many communities that have inclusionary housing ordinances that haven't worked, meaning that no units have been built. There is typically a fee in lieu that's attached with these types of programs, so I can pay a fee rather than build the unit. And then that fee in turn it goes into a housing trust fund, and I may give that money to a nonprofit developer to build units. So depending on your definition of success, if I want to generate money through an inclusionary housing or zoning program, then I can do that through a relatively low fee in lieu. If I want to produce units, I need to be a community that has a moderate to high volume of development, or it's probably not worth the pain of going through inclusionary. It's got to be economically feasible, as I mentioned. And I want to stop here and talk a little bit about an approach that Seattle has done, which is pretty interesting. So Seattle, about 4 or 5 years ago, said, we're going to upzone the entire city. Everybody gets a little more density. Everybody gets density by right. Downtown gets a whole heck of a lot more density. But in exchange for that, you have to build affordable housing or pay a fee. And they calibrated the fee such that in their lower income areas where they felt like there was the most vulnerability for displacement, that they would incentivize developers pay the fee so they could turn that around and give that to the nonprofits, who would then build the types of units at the price points that's needed to stabilize that community. So they're really tailoring that to that community. And then in other parts like downtown, remember I talked about sort of this magic of height and cost. Downtown, where I can get, the sky's the limit, literally, I just have a greater ability to leverage that extra cost and and more easily build affordable units. I've just got more units to spread the costs over. So downtown, you typically see like a different requirement than you would in a non-downtown area in most communities. Seattle calibrated this at a little more of a fine grain of detail to try and get the outcomes that they wanted. So I already talked about this a little bit. You know, developers will typically say, and they're right, that inclusionary housing is going to increase housing costs. My return's going to go down. Maybe I'll stop building. I'm going to pass that on to private sector tenant, non-affordable tenants. And I would say, you know, that is definitely true, but inclusionary housing or inclusionary zoning is not the only reason costs are going up. We talked through all of that. Typically what happens is, and I'll show you a graphic in just a moment, that there's some decline in supply and then the market adjusts and investors accept lower returns and production picks back up. In communities where inclusionary zoning works, these are typically high volume communities where developers are going to build anyway. They're not going to leave the market entirely. If they leave the market, it's for other reasons. So people have left Seattle's market, I'm told, but for reasons since they passed inclusionary zoning, but those are for reasons in addition to inclusionary zoning. The other thing that I just want to acknowledge is, yes, these cross subsidies exist, but they're typically pretty low. So what we hear is, yeah, you hit me with inclusionary zoning, I'm going to increase my market rate rents at 3%, and that's pretty minimal, kind of all things considered. So we did an analysis. We've been working on some programs for Denver and for Denver's proposed expanding housing affordability initiative. And so we looked at some peer cities to understand if development, what happened. And so this shows you development over time. The thing to pay attention to is that like trend line, and you'll see that typically what happens when you implement inclusionary zoning, those are those dotted, the dotted black lines if you're looking at Seattle, is that, yeah, people rush to get their permits in, production slows a little bit, and then it adjusts, it picks back up. San Jose is kind of an interesting case in that there's just not a lot of land to develop there, and they have pretty significant height restrictions. So San Jose's is a case, and they also have a very, very relatively low payout. So it's easier for me in San Jose to buy my way out of production than it is for me to actually build those units. I'm going to lose more if I build the units and operate them at low rents over time. So San Jose is less of a success story because they don't have the volume and they don't have the height. So if y'all are thinking about this, and I wanted to touch on this and spend some time on it because a lot of Colorado communities are asking this question. If I do it, what do I need to worry about? Which household AMI levels should the program target? And you could do a housing needs analysis and understand if this is going to help you out. Should the units all be the same? Longmont, and for a community of your size, I would actually look at Longmont's policy. They've got a really reasonable policy. They've been tracking it for a long time. They actually don't require that the affordable units have the exact same finishings inside as the market rate units. That's a bit unusual, but it's their way to say, look, you're building, we're asking you to rent lower. You can make these slightly less nice than a market rate unit. Should developers be allowed to develop units off-site? This is, again, a policy call. It really has a lot to do with the land that you have available, and if you are okay with a little bit of concentration in those units, or if you're really going for mixed income. I talked about the economic feasibility analysis. That would determine everything from AMI targets, the proportion of units that should be affordable, what the term should be. And then the last bullet here is that fee in lieu. So if you allow developers to buy their way out of this obligation and the fee is lower than what it costs to build the units, they typically will. If you want to generate funds for a housing trust fund, that's one way of doing it. You can also do it with something called a linkage fee. But you have to really step back and think about, what are my objectives in doing this? What am I asking of developers in the community? And if it's to generate money, maybe there's another way of doing it. And then again, I talked a little bit about those the offsets that are in House Bill 1117. The other thing I want to touch on that I feel like is really undervalued in these conversations about affordability is affirmative marketing. So you all asked me some questions about how do people know what their rights are. There's a whole set of folks who have a lot of trouble finding affordable housing. We have a statewide, search system, but it's a little bit dated and it doesn't tell you, I think, if a unit's available. I did a focus group with people with disabilities a couple of years ago as part of a fair housing study we did in Denver, and many of them, this is before we had a source of income protection. So these folks had vouchers and their landlords were going to stop taking their vouchers. And so they were upset. They weren't sure where they were going to go. They needed housing along transit. They were really in a tough situation. And I asked them, how do you find out about housing? Now, they do have a caseworker on site, like a housing counselor on site, but the way these programs work in trying to, the programs that provide organizations with vouchers to then give to their clients, they don't get reimbursed for the housing search side of things. So these nonprofits are needing to fundraise because they don't get paid for that process that's very lengthy right now because our housing market's so tight to get low-income people in the units. They get paid for the administration of those vouchers once the folks find the units. But this just tells you how hard it is for somebody who may be visually impaired, doesn't understand how to use the internet effectively because they're a senior. I don't know how to use the internet effectively a lot of times. I can't drive, so I can't get to the unit or to the property manager's office and wait in line when applications become available. Tremendous barriers to access. There is a solution that San Francisco developed. They have a program called Dahlia, like the flower, and you can Google Dahlia San Francisco and see their search engine. It's really cool. It qualifies people for housing and it uses push technology to let them know those units are available. So again, there's progress being made, but that affirmative marketing I think is a really big barrier to making these types of programs successful. And then last but not least, the other thing to give attention is administration and compliance. These types of programs do need a full-time staff or more to run them and to make sure they're complicated, to make sure that the units are not only built, but that they stay affordable. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding. So I kind of suggested that you can raise and start a housing trust fund through Inclusionary Housing program, and some do that. Local housing trust funds are more and more popular because of the decline in federal funds up until like 2 years ago. So, the most popular, or I would say the most notable communities that have had a lot of success in raising money, Denver has recently, but the city of Austin, they've consistently done general obligation bonds to raise money for affordable housing, and they've been quite successful. They also have a very strategy-driven approach, so they are very intentional about how they're going to use those dollars, and they have a blueprint, a strategic housing blueprint that they put out every 5 years to report back to the community about how those funds have been used. Albuquerque did something similar many years ago, but their bond was targeted to certain special needs and MFI levels. Denver's had a variety of initiatives. Most of Denver's are focused on helping people who are experiencing homelessness. But my favorite one is the Portland region. And I had a client in suburban Portland so Portland came together, the whole Portland region came together. It would be like all the entities that are part of DRCOG, our Council of Governments, and passed a bond, a regional bond. And I had a suburban client at the time whose funding went up 17 times as a result of this bond. So suddenly they had all this money to be able to build the type of housing they wanted and where they wanted. It was a real win in terms of regional funding. The last piece I have here is this tip, which is if you create a housing trust fund, be sure to fund it. So there are many trust funds out there, and your city council could say, let's start a housing trust fund. We need a local source of revenue, and maybe we'll put $100,000 in it this year or $1 million, but it's not a recurring source of funds. And so to be effective, you've got to fund it, and you need to fund it regularly so it builds up and it's a true contributor to affordable housing. I also want to talk a bit about code reform. This is also, super popular right now, particularly when we look back to the Euclid decision and all the things that carried with it, all the baggage that came with that. Zoning's really under fire these days. So just a couple of barriers that we see. We typically do zoning reviews. So we have a couple planners in our staff, but we're not a planning firm. We don't write code. We typically do zoning reviews for fair housing studies that we do. So the types of barriers that we see the most, I'm just going to go through those, and you can think about, if these sound familiar and this is something to look at in Englewood. Or I'm going to start with occupancy restrictions and definitions of family. So I'll tell a quick story. We're doing a focus group in Boulder with women who were older, in their 70s and 80s, and they all lived in homes in Boulder, and they said, we would really like to live together. But Boulder, like many college towns, has a limit on how many unrelated people can live together. Denver has, Denver had a limit up until recently. And these ladies couldn't live together. They would be violating code if they sold their homes, pooled their resources, and moved into one of the ladies' homes. So most of the time when you hear about occupancy restrictions or definitions of family, in my opinion, is kind of silly. I don't think codes should be defining family. They should be defining, they should be focused on public health and safety and what that means. But in terms of occupancy restrictions, it's really important to step back and look at your restrictions to see if you're limiting the ability of seniors, people with disabilities, younger people. It's very common to live in cooperatives these days, from finding housing. The example that I give is that, when I think about people living together, even, younger people who drive in a cooperative setting, if I'm regulating that and I'm not regulating a family that happens to have 4 teenagers, that family with 4 teenagers could have a bigger impact just in terms of use, coming and going, traffic. And so you have to think about if you're treating different types of households differently because of these restrictions and really what that means. Preference for single-family detached homes. This is a big deal right now, this missing middle. I gave you that demonstration of what it costs to actually truly build a duplex or a triplex these days, or a townhome. It's a lot. So if you are considering like a Minneapolis or a California, rollback of single-family detached only zoning districts, just be aware of, it gives you supply, but it doesn't always give you affordability, and it's a pretty slow change over time. Back to Austin, they have a program called Affordability Unlocked, where they only allow this type of change if those developments have a significant number of affordable units. So I can, in certain cases in Austin, I could tear down a single-family detached home, I could put a 3-plex on it, but a majority of those units would have to be affordable. They'd also, if they were rental units, have to carry some provisions to make sure that I wasn't evicting people unnecessarily. I'm accepting source of income. I'm accepting some of the income sources we talked about. And then I think you all are familiar, with citizen-led initiatives to reduce growth, not in my backyard syndrome. Just be careful. Citizens are really charged up around housing and zoning right now, and just be mindful that your planning commission or your city council is not treating different types of providers differently based on citizen feedback. Density limitations, just a quick nod to thinking about density really strategically and thinking about where you can put density that it will actually return affordable units so that you'll get units and that it makes sense for your community. I talked a lot about some of these before. We just did an analysis, and I just wanted to share some results of this. This is for Colorado. We asked the question of, by income level, do people occupy different types of housing? What might that look like? And so the blue is single family detached, And the orange is 5 to 49 unit multifamily complexes. And you see here that people households earning less than 50,000 are truly more likely to live in multifamily complexes, particularly those middle-sized ones, 50 or 5 to 50 units, much less likely to live in single-family detached homes. And just the inverse is true for high-income households. So this is all to say that what you build, like housing type, what you allow really does matter because it is linked with affordability. And what I want to end on, I'm going all the way back to cost burden. This is cost burden by income and by unit type to just give you a sense of, does it matter? Like, am I actually providing some affordability if I build a variety of housing types? And the answer is yes, and it also depends. So if I am, this is where it gets a little bit weird because we're seeing cost burden move into those higher income brackets. If I'm making the highest income here, highest income bracket, 75 to 100,000, and I'm a renter, if I'm occupying a single family detached home, I'm much more likely to be cost burdened than any other kind of unit, particularly a duplex. That is also true for triplexes and up to small multifamily for that middle income bracket. Low income people are pretty much universally cost burdened, depending on, or regardless of the type. And that's also pretty much true of owners. But I anticipate that this will change as our housing costs continue to go up and as we see more variance in housing types, that you actually will see more fluctuation in burden and price point for those missing middle housing types, that they do actually truly offer a more affordable product. So I threw a lot at you all, and you have about 4 minutes now. I'll just go ahead and take any more questions before we wrap up.
Does anyone have any questions for Heidi? Go ahead,
Idea.
Carson.
So when an inclusionary zoning set of rules is implemented, how does that typically happen? Is it through public vote at the municipal level, county level, state level? Is it sometimes done by city councils without a vote? Like, how do these things come into play?
Yeah, it's actually through, it doesn't require a vote. It's through like a change in your ordinance, in your land use code. So it would be updating a zoning ordinance.
Is that typically at the county level or this municipal level?
It depends. So if you're an incorporated community, it would be within that community at the municipal level. A county county zoning would cover unincorporated areas.
So like in Seattle, when you said they increased density in all zones in the city, so they had like, did they have a zone of R1 that then now is no longer R1? Is that what that means?
They allowed more density within like the equivalent R1, if that makes sense. There's
No,
some
it
areas
doesn't.
that
So
were
R1 became R2? I'm
well,
confused.
yeah, it's not quite that linear. So when you think about a big city or a medium-sized city, you think about all the different places where you could add density and all the nuances within the districts. So they took out some portions of the city where an upzone really didn't make sense, but then added the ability just basically to do more to make better use of land everywhere else. But it did vary depending on the district.
So some parts of the city remained strictly R1, for instance, while other
Yes.
parts that were R1
Yeah.
became higher density?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It's more complicated than that, Carson, but and I don't fully know the nuances, but that's the basics of what they did.
And so the other cities you mentioned that did implement inclusional housing policies were San Jose and what was the other one?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of California cities, state law in California requires that cities do a lot of different things. And so in California, inclusionary zoning is very common. It doesn't always mean that it works. A lot of Western states do not allow inclusionary zoning, so we don't see it commonly in the West. But in the Northwest, it is very common. Portland, California cities. It's also very, very common in the East Coast. Minneapolis just passed, and actually a suburb of Minneapolis, Edina, has a very, very successful program, and I think their program is more successful than Minneapolis's because their economic feasibility, it was structured so it was very much tailored to the community. It's been real successful.
When inclusionary zoning is implemented, like in the case of like Seattle, where it's pretty wide, how does that affect property values?
And so that's a very, very good question. I would say there are there's mixed information about what that does. And the problem is because, and I'll go ahead and end on this, just sort of the complexity of really understanding what housing policy's limitations are and where its limitations are and where the value is that it's really hard for me to isolate the factors that are causing housing costs to go up. And so there have been a number of studies that have tried to do that, but that field of research is relatively new, and the market that we're in right now is very much unprecedented. So I think we'll know more about, like, Seattle's program is relatively new. We'll know more about the impacts of all of this stuff in about 5 to 10 years.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go ahead and let you all wrap up. I'm not sure who to turn it back to, but I just wanted to say I appreciate the opportunity. I know I covered a lot of territory really fast, but thank you for being here tonight.
Heidi, thank you so much for being here. It's very good information. We have recorded this session, so I will put it up on the Inglewood Engage Code Next page, and I'll send that link out to everyone. Just as a quick reminder, next week's meeting will be held in person at the Guild, which is at 3435 South Inca Street, and that's right next to the Inglewood Civics Center. If you would email me if you will not be able to attend, or if you're uncomfortable meeting in person, I'd greatly appreciate that. So our guest presenter next week is Brad Power, the Director of the Community Development Department. And so I'm turning it over to him so he can give you a teaser for next week.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everybody. And as Nancy said, my name is Brad Power. I'm the Director of the Community Development Department. And I certainly hope you all have been enjoying the series so far. And we are going to mix it up a bit next week. We're going to actually divide you into teams, and you're going to be working on a bit of a challenge to actually build a community. And so in the next couple of days, we'll be sending some information to you about kind of some of the parameters that we're going to ask you to think about as you contemplate what you would do in your teams. And if you could just, it's quick, couple pages, if you could just kind of review that between early next week and Thursday evening, that would be helpful. We'll also go over it as we gather next week, as Nancy said, at the Guild. And you'll be using these. If you can't see, it's not my, well, I knew that would work. I got a green Lego against this background, so it'll work. So you'll be building with Legos next week. So we'll all revert to some level of our childhood. So with that, I will just wrap it up for the evening. Thank our guest Heidi again. Thank you all for attending. And we are really looking forward to seeing you in person next week for a little bit of fun with some actual community building. So thanks again, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.